then, the swimmers dropped out of their helicopters and attached 2 orange life rafts to the module, one for decontamination and the other for recovery. One of the swimmers opened Columbia's hatch, threw in 3 green nylon one-piece biological isolation suits, and slammed the hatch shut. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins each zipped on his suit. The American flag had been stitched to their left shoulders, their names across their chests. Their faces were made alien by oval lenses and breathing masks. The swimmer then reopened the hatch and helped the astronauts into the decontamination raft. The 4 of them floated on the ocean's gentle surface, under clouds, looking in those outfits more like Martians than moonwalkers. They were sprayed down with sodium hypochlorite. The module itself would get a betadine bath, transferred to the recovery raft, and lifted like tuna in billy pug rescue nets into Helicopter 66, Old 66 to the Black Knights inside. The chopper normally hunted for lost surfers and enemy submarines off the California coast. Now its role had changed. For the astronauts in their zipped-up suits, it made more like a pretty good furnace. But the heat was a small complaint. During an earlier recovery exercise, high winds and seas had stalled the lift, and sharks had forced the swimmers back in their rafts. Now that there were no second chances, each part of the plan had to fit into the next without seams. The decontamination raft and whatever invisible cargo it now harbored was scuttled, and the chopper made the short 13-mile flight to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, on which 2,115 officers and men, 107 NASA officials and civilians, a trio of pool reporters, and President Richard M. Nixon were waiting to make 3 men in a bucket big again. The excitement had left the president first needing to take a leak. "Marine, where's the head?" was his opening verbal salvo after splashdown. But no wives awaited. Old 66 touched down to cheers on the flight deck, was dropped by elevator to hangar deck number 2, and Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins walked through a plastic tunnel into their next new home, the mobile quarantine facility. Really, it was a souped-up Airstream trailer, a 35-foot-long shining cylinder of unpainted aluminum, smooth except for the rivets. Inside, it looked just like about every other Airstream pulled off the assembly line, with the exception of an obtrusive ventilator above the fold-down table in the kitchenette. Isolation was guaranteed by negative internal pressure and the filtration of any effluent air. That was the science of it. For the astronauts, though, it was just the latest in a long string of tin cans. Once inside, they showered, changed into blue flight suits, and settled in for speeches. Nixon, his bladder successfully emptied, told the 3 men that they had been the principal actors in the greatest week in the history of the world since creation. Now joining the trio in their trailer were a technician named John Hirosaki and a NASA physician, Dr. William Carpentier. The good doctor was never really part of the gang. There was a divide between him and the astronauts, the same gulf that's always broken off pilots from odds-makers and logicians, flight surgeons especially. They had no dreaming in them. Asked what would happen if a medical emergency hit the crew of Apollo 11 before they got off ship, Dr. Carpentier said, "That would be rough, but I'd say the captain would have to treat the astronauts like carriers of an infectious disease and keep them in quarantine." The panic in a dying man's face viewed through a window would be trumped by the most pessimistic clinical imaginings. With that grim scenario in mind, the crew of the USS Hornet began humping a souped-up Airstream to Pearl Harbor, full steam ahead. In the meantime, the 3 travelers were subject to the first of several physical exams and asked to fill out customs forms, like any other tourists. In the space reserved for declarations, they wrote moon rock and moon dust samples, manifests attached. Aside from border agents, thousands more islanders were waiting for them by the time they made it to Honolulu. As many as 25,000 hoped to catch sight of the fresh-tinned astronauts. The mobile quarantine facility was lifted from the carrier, loaded onto a truck, and ferried through the waving crowds from the water to Hickam Air Force Base, where a U.S. Air Force C-141 jet transport waited to swallow the trailer whole. They were back in flight over the Pacific.